Ladies and gentlemen, very well welcome to this side event titled From Pledges to Action, Governance for the Effective Implementation of the Paris Agreement. On behalf of the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences, Center for Policy Research in India, and Inter-Parliamentary Union, very well welcome and thank you for joining us today. And a special welcome to those joining us online tonight, those who couldn't be here in person. Well, we're meeting here today just 2 days before the summit in Glasgow is scheduled to end, when the whole world is watching with hope and anxiety to see to what extent the world leaders, the negotiators, can deliver on the commitments and actions which are required to address the climate emergency. And I think many would agree with me that we have seen quite a lot of promising pledges so far, pledges from governments to net zero targets, including some large emitters such as China, India, Saudi Arabia, Russia, which haven't pledged net zero targets before. We have also seen commitments by the groups of governments, such as powering Past Coal Alliance, where 28 new members have joined, including some governments, pledging to turn away from coal. We have seen also Glasgow Leaders Initiative on forest and land use, which have pledged to end deforestation, and so on. You know that there were various commitments. But what people outside are wondering, to what extent those political pledges would actually turn into action and would actually help us reduce emissions and deliver on resilient societies. You probably have seen that International Energy Agency published a few days ago a very promising analysis that if the targets pledged by the world leaders at this conference would be met, we might be able to keep global warming to 1.8 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. However, there is a big if in that analysis, and that if is only if the governments keep to the commitments that they're making here. And so the conversations today, we have an amazing panel representing experts, academics, practitioners, policymakers, parliamentarians, and politicians to talk about what needs to happen and what is already happening to turn political commitments into delivery on the ground. And one issue that has been raised is the need to put in place frameworks, policy frameworks and legislation to make sure that politicians cannot negate on the commitments that they're making. And so the different means that we require to make pledges credible are legislative frameworks at the national level, credible national institutions that can actually deliver on those legislative frameworks and pledges, but also strong mechanisms for coordinating action at the national level and for engaging wider society. So our panel today is going to address those issues, sharing experiences from Latin America, Europe, Africa, and we're going to learn how different countries are dealing with these issues. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Navroz Dubash from the Center for Policy Research in India. Navroz is well known to many of you because he is coordinating lead author for IPCC's sixth assessment report, in particular chapter on dealing with governance and institutions. He has been active in climate debates since 1990, when he was the first international coordinator of the Climate Action Network. So Navroz is joining us from Singapore, so it's 2:30 for him in the morning, so we're very grateful for that. Navroz, you have the floor, please. Navroz, we can't hear you yet.
Okay.
Could you, there we go.
There we go. There we go. I think this should work. Thank you so much, Alina, and a good afternoon to all of you there, and good evening, good morning to those of you online like me. First, let me just say on behalf of CPR how pleased we are to do this event with the Grantham Institute and with the International Parliamentary Union. and I only wish I was there in person to join all of you. So Alina, if we could just have the slides that I had put together, please. Are those up? Aha, okay. So I'm afraid I cannot see the slides, Alina. Is it? Should I just go ahead and follow along here? I can do that. Yeah, that's great. Okay, good, very good. So I can. Sorry for the technical hitches. So what I'm going to try and do today is take all of us through a research project that involved many partners. The slide just prior listed a paper that just came out in Science with several co-authors, and we tried to basically look at climate institutions, in a sense, as the missing link, as Alina said, between pledges and actions. And as Alina again set us up, in some ways a motivating question for this COP are climate, our country pledges by all these countries that we've heard about over the last couple of weeks. Are they meaningful? Next slide, please. So one way of answering the question of whether pledges are meaningful is to actually look at the way in which the pledges were put together. Are they founded on adequate analysis of options and trajectories? Are they based on decision-making processes that create political buy-in? Do we actually think that countries will stick by these pledges? Will they actually implement them? Will they have institutional machinery through which to implement them? And will they be supported by course correction mechanisms? So monitoring, reporting, a way of coming back and ratcheting up pledges down the future. So all of these things are actually institutional questions. You can't do any of these things without having robust institutions in place to back all these pledges. So in a sense, the question about whether country pledges are meaningful is at core an institutional question. And that's what we mean when we say that in some ways institutions are the missing link in this conversation about pledges and whether they're meaningful and whether they lead to action. Can I go to the next slide, please? So in an effort to try and answer this question, to in a sense shed light on what we felt is an understudied area about climate institutions, several of us got together over a few years to do this project that we've called Varieties of Climate Governance. And one of the core questions was, how do climate institutions emerge? Because we can't presume that every country has full control over setting up these institutions as and when they're required. We looked at 8 major economies, 4 of them in the developed world, 4 in the developing world, and we had 13 leading climate scholars from all over the world looking at this question. And while I can't go into a great deal of detail here, though I understand from my colleagues that copies of this special issue of environmental politics that came out are available there at the COP, the one point I really want to single out from this presentation is to say that what emerges is that climate institutions come out of country context. They emerge in a path-dependent way from national political context. And so one size does not fit all. So instead, institutions actually emerge over time in response to country politics. And as a result of which, there are many types of climate institutions. And I've put sort of quotes around the word climate, because in a sense, there are some institutions we think of, like the UK Climate Change Committee, which is explicitly set up to look at climate change, that are purpose-built institutions, if you like. In other cases, climate change gets layered on top of other institutions, such as the US EPA, which de facto became a climate institution when the US Supreme Court declared greenhouse gases a pollutant, thereby empowering the EPA to take on climate change. But we also have institutions further outside the net, if you like. So for example, in Brazil, where the Ministry of Forests actually became the most important de facto climate institution because most of what Brazil did to address climate change ended up under the control of that ministry. So the range of what is a climate institution is really broad. Related to this then is that efforts to actually build these institutions are tied to what country politics will support. You can't outreach your politics. We have the case of Australia, which created a climate law and subsequently had to roll it back. And we've seen the similar tussles, of course, in the US. So these institutions may emerge, but they may also ebb. And but the good news is that over time, institutions themselves can shape the political conditions that create the political grounds for their own strengthening. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. We also try to explore what is it that climate institutions actually do? What are the main challenges? And I think all of us could come up with our own laundry list. But in this paper that recently came out in Science, we flagged three things, which are coordination, building consensus, and strategy setting. So I just want to take you through these three things, please. If you could have the next slide. Yeah, actually, can I just go down one on this one as well, please? Yeah, thank you. That's great. So there are three broad climate governance challenges. The first is because of the scale and scope of climate change, the fact that it is an all-of-government issue. This isn't just about energy ministries or agriculture ministries or urban ministries. It has to be across government. The task of coordination is extremely large. And while there are other cross-cutting such issues like food security and so on and so forth, I think this is taken really to an extreme in the case of the climate challenge. And it's not just coordination across actors, but also coordination across government, but also coordination across actors, because we've seen that non-state actors, cities, local groups, businesses all have very large roles. And so the coordination task extends to all of these various actors. So how do governments go about doing this? Well, one thing that they do is they just repurpose environment ministries. And that has often proved not very potent, simply because environment ministries tend to be lower down the totem pole. Sometimes they reorganize ministries, such as the UK did, or China has done, where it actually embedded control over climate change in its very powerful National Resources and Development Commission. The third thing that they do is create interministerial coordination committees. So so India has an empowered committee of secretaries that is meant to bang heads together across ministries. And of course, the overarching thing they do is they create climate laws, as the UK has done, and Germany has done. Down one, please. The next set of things that institutions have to take care of is building consensus. And what do I mean by this? Well, again, because of the scale and scope of the climate challenge, the fact that we have to essentially unlock the linkage between economic growth and carbon, between economic growth and fossil fuels. The process of addressing climate change creates a large number of losers, and losers from the political process are going to try and throw sand in the wheels. And so institutions are the way in which potential winners and potential losers can be brought together, and conflict can be potentially mediated as a way of addressing possible blockers and making it possible for climate policy to move ahead. Now, let's look at some examples of this. In the UK, for example, the Climate Change Commission has actually established a reputation of providing extremely credible information and analysis that then allows different groups to mobilize around that analysis to push together political support for key issues. In other countries, we've seen deliberative bodies. So in South Africa, they have a National Economic Development and Labor Commission that has reframed climate change substantially around a job creation agenda, and thereby, in a sense, built a broader platform for political consensus. The third set of issues, and can I just go down one, please? The third set of issues is, of course, strategy setting. And this ties to the fact, again, a big theme in this COP, that we are on a clock here. We have to achieve net zero, ideally globally, by 2050. So countries have to move along. This can't just happen at the same pace as political processes allow for, but we have to actually push the boundaries of those political processes. And so purpose-built organizations such as the UK Climate Change Committee, Germany has set up something similar, China has similar bodies, or head of government-led bodies such as India's Prime Minister's Advisory Council. These are the kinds of institutions that have also been set up. So in a sense, we have these three broad climate governance challenges, and we have a range of imperfect efforts at addressing them. And I just want to now take you through in the next slide, if we could go to that, please, to, in a sense, the kind of elements that countries have used to put together climate governance. I want to stress that this is not a cookie cutter approach. This is not a simple question of adopting best practice and transplanting it into another institutional and political context. These various elements combine in different ways in different countries based on national politics. But the elements do tend to be common. And those are, first of all, laws that can establish the direction of travel. I've talked about the UK law, Germany, other countries are very rapidly implementing laws. And of course, the Grantham Institute is leading really the tracking and analysis of those laws, Alina's own work and those of her colleagues. But interestingly, laws can both be take the form of sort of target setting followed by implementation mechanisms, but they could also take the form of trying to mainstream climate change within existing ministries. And that tends to be often the approach that many developing countries take. Expert bodies, Germany now has one, some Scandinavian countries have one, New Zealand has one, and of course, many of them are informed by the UK Climate Change Committee, tend to be a really important part of the emerging institutional framework. It's critical that they be independent, credible, and therefore can actually drive public conversation and also engage civil society. A third ingredient are these high-level coordinating bodies, and most countries now have them. China, in a sense, has taken it to an extreme. They have what they call national leading groups that really set the tone for Chinese climate policy making that gets driven down through the governmental system. And also, in a sense, in various cases, I think this idea of repurposing existing bodies through mainstreaming, and perhaps the best example there is the Brazilian example. I talked about how the forest ministry, in a sense, became a de facto climate ministry. And over time, as some of their forest governance efforts took roots, climate responsibilities were explicitly layered onto the forest ministry. So let me go on to the final slide here. I want to make sure we leave enough time for discussion. We have a wonderful panel. So just to quickly try and summarize what I really hope we can take away from this conversations. So to begin with, this basic point that institutions do matter. They matter for setting targets and for implementing policies. The question of climate pledges and their credibility is substantially, of course not entirely, but substantially also an institutional question. We would suggest that countries keep in focus these three design challenges: coordination, building consensus, and setting strategy. Institutional development, however, is limited by political conditions. We don't have a free hand, we don't have a blank slate, which is why best practice approaches are subject to local context. But then institutions and policy and politics influence each other. So as institutions develop, they can change political conditions. You can actually win more support. For example, the South African case I gave you, where job creation through NEDLAC became a basis for building a bigger platform for climate action. And as a result, even modest institutions can shape politics and ratchet up over time. So I guess the message for countries is, please try and crystallize whatever agreement you have in institutional processes, and that then will create the grounds for more favorable politics over time, or at least the potential for it, which then can lead to a subsequent ratcheting up of institutions. So in other words, it's not just policies that need to ratchet up over time, but institutions do too, through the interplay with national politics. So that's my final slide. Can we just go to the next slide, where we provide some QR codes? If you have a chance to download these publications and want to email us, we'd be really grateful for the interaction. Thank you so much for showing up to this event. I know it's the end of a long COP day. And Alina, back to you.
Thank you, Navroz. Thank you so much. And thank you. Thank you for sharing this important insights with us, in particular emphasizing that one size doesn't fit all, and we can't just import the model that worked in one country to another one without thinking it through, how it fits the local conditions and politics. So I'm very pleased to open this panel discussion. We have fantastic speakers with us today. And first of all, I'm going to go to Mr. Cedric Frolik, who is the Member of Parliament and House Chairperson for Committees Oversight and ICT of South Africa. Mr. Frolik is well known to many of you also as the chair of the Globe International in the past, which is the Organization of Parliamentarians for Climate Change. So very pleased to have you with us. So my first question is, South Africa has gone through drastic changes in its climate policy, from making quite ambitious international commitments and launching a very successful renewable energy program, then having some pushback on that, and recently, again, reporting on some very exciting national developments. So we're very keen to hear from you what is actually happening in South Africa on the policy front, and how can pledges that are made in the NDC and internationally be translated into national action?
No, thank you very much, and good evening to you and fellow panelists, and also to the audience. South Africa, as a country in Africa, is compelled to look into the climate situation and the devastation that is caused across the continent by certain climate calamities. We are mindful of the fact that while we are propagating and promoting an approach by South Africa, we must also do it in terms of the rest of the continent, where some of the capacities needs to be upscaled. It poses thus one of the greatest challenges that we have, because it impacts directly on our social development as well as our economic progress on the continent. And the South African government, and I must add here, especially during the phase of COVID-19, we came to the strong realization that we are not equipped. We are not ready to confront the pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic then exposed our lack of preparedness to deal with crises of this nature. And together with the government, we sat and we said, but what about climate change? What impact will climate change have when all these calamities happen? What disaster risk measures do you have in place? And what are you going to do to emerge from the economic crisis caused by COVID-19? And that is where we supported, as a Parliament of the Republic of South Africa, the government's Green Recovery Plan. And the Green Recovery Plan basically says, our economy has almost been decimated. What are we going to do to rebuild the economy? And while we were active in the climate change arena, already put different laws, carbon emission laws in place, new energy plans, we said we need to pay closer attention to our ambition targets that we have set. The Presidential Commission on Climate Change that was established by President Ramaphosa then came back to us. And it reported to the country to say that, you know, unless we deal decisively with the climate transition in South Africa, which we call a just climate transition, to ensure that no one is left behind, we are going to have certain difficulties. And that's where the social compact became important, to take people along. The previous presenter have referred to NEDLAC as one of those key sectors in society working with government to develop the plans. But planning is one thing. You must put it into action. And the synchronized way in which we then went about having this realization that you cannot escape this any longer. You need to up the ambition. We are mindful of the fact that in our country currently we have rolling blackouts because of our dependency on a single source of power generation, which is coal. 90% of our energy supply is generated through coal. And we cannot put our country further at risk by doing that. So the energy mix then becomes important, but at the same time, we need to keep in mind South Africa is a trading partner with key economies of the world. And some of those economies in future will make certain demands as to how do you produce these different products that you have. So we had to change the mindset completely and say, up the ambition. Let's phase out. And currently there is a project that has been started as a pilot project to say, let's start phasing out our dependency on coal. The Komati coal power-fired station is currently the one that will be put to the test to see what will the impact be on those immediate communities in terms of the just transition. So from now until 2030, we will see up to 10 coal-fired power stations being decommissioned completely. But how do we supplement that? To do that, we need technological support. But we also need financial support from the developed world. And that's why we're trying to keep them to the commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement. But we also upscaled our NDCs to say that with the necessary support, we will cut greenhouse gas emissions emanating from coal by up to 27% come 2030. And that is a huge improvement on the previous NDC that has been there. So we are not waiting on this climate change conference to give us new direction. We are practically busy implementing measures so that we can have a greener future. What are the things that we are currently doing? We have, apart from the Presidential Climate Commission, also adopted the National Adaptation Strategy. We have implemented an enhanced mitigation system with robust monitoring and evaluation. We are also developing a long-term low-emission strategy. And, of course, we submitted our updated and significantly more ambitious NDC ahead of COP26. I also want to state that part of this process, because it is institutional, and we need to make it more concrete so that it can also be subject to oversight by the policymakers and the parliamentarians. So there's a climate change bill that is now on the table. It's in front of the committee, and it is being developed. But we've also gone further, and we've said in terms from a parliamentary perspective, we welcome, of course, the offer that's on the table based on our NDCs that has been tabled, that more than $8 billion has been made available for our just transition. However, as policymakers, we are aware that a lot of countries in Africa, especially and in the developing world, is sitting in a debt trap. The pledges that was made by developed countries in terms of COVID-19 assistance and vaccination support, all of it hasn't materialized. So we must be careful that we get the financial blend, the funding blend must be in place. And that mix must ensure that countries are not put into further debt. It means that we must look at the combination and the mixture of concessions, of grants, and also of loans. But furthermore, we must also, and we have built it into our strategy now, to say that similarly, the recipients of support must be accountable, and there must be transparency, and there must be clear reporting deadlines, so that there is a relationship of trust that is being re-established with developed countries. There's still a lot of outstanding commitments from the Paris Agreement. However, we believe that the announcement that has been made and that was hailed by President Ramaphosa as a game changer in terms of cooperation between developed countries and developing countries have the potential to take the process forward. But we need to scrutinize what is in that package, what is in the offer that is there, so that parliamentarians can also explain to their constituencies exactly how it will impact directly in their lives and how will it improve the environment for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Frolik. Thank you for sharing your experience and also in particular for highlighting the importance of making sure that recovery from COVID-19 is compatible with the objectives of climate change and also demonstrating how strong political commitment actually helps attract climate finance. So our next speaker, unfortunately, couldn't be with us today in person, but he is very well known to you, is Mr. Jairam Ramesh, who is a member of Parliament of India, and in the past is a Minister of Environment and Forests, and also Minister of Rural Development and Drinking Water and Sanitation of India. So Mr. Ramesh is going to join us via video. Could we have a video, please?
Mr. Ramesh, from your experience as former Minister for Environment and Forest and as head of an important parliamentary committee on science and technology, what are the roles of dedicated institutions in setting targets, winning support for climate policy, and ensuring implementation?
Well, it depends on the country, but certainly in a country like India, where you have, we have 29 state governments, we have a union government, we have a federal government, and we also have local governments, which are increasingly getting involved and concerned with the consequences of climate change. So I think the most important institutional, innovation that we require is to look at multiple layers of governance. You have, the central, the union or the federal government, you have the provincial or state governments, and you have the local governments. So the target setting, and more importantly, the enforcement of the actions that you take on domestically or globally is dependent on different layers of government, different institutions of government. So I think that's so far in India, particularly, climate change has been looked at from a federal perspective, from the perspective of the central government. And I think increasingly we are beginning to be acutely aware and conscious of the fact that this is a very limited perspective. You need the state governments to be involved. On many issues like urban heat or, flooding of coastal areas, you need the local governments to be involved. I think that's the big change that we have to bring about. We have to bring about this synergy between these three layers of government.
And switching gears to the domestic track with Parliament, what are the levers you have or could use, and are they effective at all in pushing climate policy? The question essentially is, can we move away from the executive really and have an independent role for Parliament in pushing ambition?
Well, Parliament has no direct role. Parliamentary committees, by and large, scrutinize legislation and, occasionally study issues of overriding importance. But most of the actions are executive actions. I mean, let's take the NDCs, for example, that India has announced. They don't require parliamentary intervention. They don't require any parliamentary approvals. They don't require parliamentary scrutiny. Parliamentary committees can review. They can bring different stakeholders together to assess. Parliamentary committees can be a very important tool of what in international climate change negotiations is called MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And I hope that's going to be one outcome of the Glasgow, summit, the Paris rulebook. We still don't have the Paris rulebook. The architecture at Paris was a bottom-up architecture for the NDCs, and a top-down architecture for monitoring, reporting, and verifying those NDCs. Now, the parliamentary committees and parliamentary institutions, Parliament as an institution, plays a very important role in ensuring domestic accountability, and that gives certain degree of confidence to the international community that what the government of the day is announcing by way of its international pledges and international commitments is actually being scrutinized and is actually being examined in some technical detail.
You spoke about legislation. What sort of law, if at all, would fit the direction India is taking?
I'm not entirely convinced that we need a law. I mean, I don't. In 2009, I had actually drafted a climate law. That was an idea that was perhaps too premature. I had actually, mooted the idea of climate legislation. But that was an idea basically, that was an idea keeping the international MRV in view. I mean, because there was a lot of debate at that time as to how do countries hold themselves internationally accountable for domestic actions. So that was when I proposed in Parliament and outside the idea of having climate legislation. At that time, it was not. It was in fact criticized. But now I'm finding, some people are talking about a climate law, but now I'm not entirely convinced that we need a law. I mean, I think we've made commitments. We've made these commitments in various areas. We've made commitments in the field of renewable energy. We have made commitments in the field of emissions intensity. We have made commitments in forests. I think we need to just get along, with the job of enforcing it and implementing it, monitoring it. In our system, passing the law becomes an action in itself. It becomes an end in itself. So I'm not entirely sure that having a law is going to make a big difference.
In terms of bringing the courts into play, and creating some sort of body of jurisprudence around climate, which seems to be emerging, some research is suggesting, including from CPR. Is that of potential value at all?
Well, in 2010, India was one of the few countries in the world to establish the National Green Tribunal. I think we were the third or the fourth country in the world to establish a National Green Tribunal. And that's, by the way, through an act of Parliament. That the National Green Tribunal was established. And that was, again, a legal instrument, a legal institution that was created in order to ensure enforcement of laws, ensure accountability, ensure public participation in the enforcement of the laws. But sad to say, in the last couple of years, there's been a systematic effort at emasculating the National Green Tribunal as an institution. I'm not entirely sure that it's going to survive the way it was envisaged. Yeah, but we have that institution. We have the National Green Tribunal. And we don't need to create any new institutions.
Well, a very interesting perspective from India, from the former Minister of Environment and a Member of Parliament, and one view on how the role of Parliament in India might be different from what we just heard previously from South Africa. Very interesting case. And now we have another interesting case to a country. We're going to go to the United Kingdom, a country which was actually the first one to introduce quite an ambitious climate change law, which legislated legally binding emission reduction targets, which a few countries have been learning from over the past 10 years. And what was another innovation of that legislation is creation of an independent expert advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change. And we're very fortunate to have Mike Thompson here with us, who is the chief economist of the Committee on Climate Change. So the question of accountability has come out quite a bit already in this discussion. And sometimes there is resistance from the governments to establishing independent climate change commissions because they believe that they might lose authority over policy making on climate change. So what is your response to this, Mike, based on the UK's experience? What are the key benefits of independent expert advisory bodies?
Yeah, thank you. A really good question. And as you say, we were the first, but we certainly weren't the last. We're now seeing climate committees of similar types develop around the world. And I'll just quickly plug, we've just launched an International Climate Councils network, which is kind of trying to shine a light on the different ways in which different countries have done this, kind of making that point that it's not a cookie cutter approach. It is bespoke to each different country's circumstances, and there are various different ways to do it. My experience certainly, and it's good to hear it from the outside as well, is that in the UK, having an independent expert advisor has helped us. It has helped us to have more credible targets, and it's helped us to have a more credible strategy to get there. And I think both government officials and government ministers would agree with that as well. And the big kind of, the model, I guess, is fairly simple, and it is that the experts advise and the ministers decide. So they're not obliged to do everything that the Climate Committee says. What we've tended to see is that ministers adopt the targets that the committee recommends, and then they differ from the committee in the methods that they choose to implement those targets. And that, I think, respects that the science determines that you have to do something, but politics determines what the right way through is. And actually that balance has worked, I think, fairly well in the UK. And in terms of the three key benefits, I think the three that were picked out in the presentation really resonated with me, actually. If I slightly reorder them, I think just being able to put on the table for government, if you want to act on climate change, here's what you should do, and a plan to start with, makes their life an awful lot easier, because it says, if you want to do it, here's a starting point. It then makes that coordination and that kind of negotiation point easier, because every industry that the government goes to, every department, every ministry within the government that needs to contribute to this, instead of the starting point being the BAU, which it far too often is for a government, it becomes that plan that has been put on the table as an independent plan. That's the starting point, and now you have to argue why you shouldn't do all those things that the independent advisor says you should do, rather than the government have to argue why you should do anything at all. So you shift the starting point for the discussion. I think that is hugely powerful. And then finally, consensus, absolutely. It strengthens the public case, because it is a lot easier for an independent body to come out and say this is the right thing for the UK than it is for a government who, of course, will say that. So I think you're able to strengthen consensus because you can tackle all the myths, you can tackle all the questions around the costs being too high, and you can kind of puncture these excuses for action, and that makes it easier for the politicians to do something.
Thank you, Mike. I think oftentimes one hears, particularly from smaller countries and countries which are strived for financial and human resources, that it might be difficult to form a committee at the national level which could actually have enough experts nationally who would be independent and qualified to be on such a committee. What is your advice? What would you say to those countries?
I think, again, it's kind of the horses for courses advice. It is that you have to tailor the solution to your own circumstances. That's definitely what we've seen. I mentioned this International Climate Council's network, and our smallest member is Iceland. Iceland's population is less than 400,000. So there is a real range of countries within there. That network has deliberately been set up, actually, to try and help other countries thinking about a similar model. So we're making ourselves available across the network to support other countries that are looking to develop their own councils. I think in terms of where the local expertise and the local power should lie, within our Climate Change Committee, we have a board, a committee, and we have a secretariat. And the secretariat is very analytical and must be expert in the analysis and the economics and the science, etc. And in a sense, it doesn't matter too much, I think, where that is coming from. But the decision-making part, the board, the committee part of it, that I think has to be local. That has to respect the local circumstances, the local politics. So I think if there's any kind of question of, well, where can we bring in the expertise? I think better to bring in the expertise to kind of do the analysis, to crunch the numbers, than to be making the decisions. I think that has to be a kind of fundamentally local part.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for outlining clear benefits of independent expert advisory bodies, in particular for adding credibility to the national climate policy and helping raise political consensus, which I think is a big part of what we are struggling with today in terms of translating commitments into action. So with that, I'm going to go to our next speaker, who is Max Puig. He's a politician and the Executive Vice President of the National Council for Climate Change and Clean Development Mechanism for the Dominican Republic. Mr. Puig has worked in the public sector for more than 3 decades, serving as a senator, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, and also Minister of Labor in 2008 to 2011. You're very welcome. So the Dominican Republic was one of the countries which actually met the international deadline and submitted a revised, more ambitious, nationally determined contribution at the end of last year, which established the goal of climate neutrality. How was the political debate around the nationally determined contribution and that climate neutrality? And how did you manage to get all of the stakeholders in the country on board?
Thank you very much. Consultation processes were carried out in Dominican Republic at the political and technical level, specifically regarding to resources in order to determine and/or raise ambition in the NDC. It must be acknowledged that there are sectors that carry a heavier weight than others. And the open and inclusive process allows that relevant stakeholders would commit on the dialogue table. An ad hoc committee was created for the coordination of the update and enhancement of the NDC, which was composed by a National Council for Climate Change, the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Economy, Planning and Development, and the Minister of Finance. This committee achieved the needed sectorial and cross-cutting commitment, allowing that the sectorial targets would have to greater political weight. Besides, through the committee, it was possible to have a greater follow-up of the process for the formulation of the NDC and to its consensus. Currently, the National Council of Climate Change is working on a draft climate change framework law. This project seeks to ground the NDC as a national medium-term climate change strategy, therefore making the commitment and goals established legally binding. This bill, in turn, establishes the national commitment to carbon neutrality as a long-term goal. The instrument to achieve this goal is the National Long-Term Climate Change Strategy.
Thank you. That's a very interesting example. You know, we can see in the draft law, in your case, you're actually making nationally determined contribution, a policy instrument at the national level as well, which is a very interesting way of doing this. Your organization is in charge of coordinating climate policy in the Dominican Republic. How do you go about engaging the key ministries, and do you expect that the law is going to make your task easier in any way?
Yes. The climate change bill strengthens the national governance system for this purpose. In this project, the President of the Dominican Republic has the faculty of leading and coordinating the cabinet of institutions related to national sustainable development. Under the National Council of Climate Change. This council, through its meetings, has the role of coordinating, developing, designing, and monitoring public policies that will achieve compliance with the commitment outlined in the NDC and the long-term strategy. Additionally, this bill would create the mandate for the formulation for an action plan for the implementation of the NDC, which identifies by sector the different initiatives and actions to be carried out to achieve the established goal. The transparency system is in charge of monitoring the fulfillment of this goal, identifying their effectiveness, contribution, implementer, and the financing and support carrier.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. So we're now going to change the continent again. And we're going to Spain. So we have Dr. Laura Lazaro with us today, who is a senior analyst at Elcano Royal Institute in Spain. And Laura and her organization has been very involved in the process of developing the climate change law in Spain, which has also established a net zero target and has a lot of other innovative instruments. So I think we have already mentioned today that one of the backbones of getting credible national implementation is support of citizens and support by the key political parties for the targets and pledges which are being made internationally. So based on your experience in Spain, how did civil society in particular, as you were part of that, but also other stakeholders, manage to structure different interests, because there was some opposition to the climate law? And what advice can you give to other countries in terms of building political consensus when different political interests are in place?
Thank you very much, Alina. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today with such a stellar panel of speakers. I would say that in Spain we enjoyed an enabling squeeze. So the academic literature talks about how there are international factors and national factors that both push and pull in order to help build that consensus. In Spain, the former government, the conservative PP government, stated that the Paris Agreement, when the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, that if they were re-elected, they would adopt a climate change law. They were re-elected, but then they were ousted. But we had the current government take the baton and drive the process towards the adoption of the Climate Change and Energy Transition Law last May. So there was a push from the UNFCCC. The adoption of the Paris Agreement was a key point. Then Spain hosted COP25, and that raised climate change in the awareness of our citizens. That put pressure on political parties, and that helped, according to advisors to the ministry, build that consensus. We also have in the European Union the European Green Deal and the European Climate Law, and that is the compass that Spain has to follow. So those are the international factors. Then we have some squeeze factors, and here I would highlight the IPCC reports and the Joint Research Centre reports from the European Commission that tell us that Spain is a climate hotspot within Europe, and that environmental, social and economic consequences are going to be greater than in other geographical locations in Europe. We also have benefited from policy diffusion. So the Climate Change Act and the French Climate Law and Energy Transition Law have also been touted as elements that have helped build consensus on the need for a law and the need for certain elements to make this law robust. And if you read the Spanish climate change law, you can see an expert advisory body for climate change. You can see risk disclosure by big listed companies, by asset managers, by banks. So I think policy diffusion has played a role, even though it's not statistically significant in the statistical and econometric analyses made by Claire Fankhauser and Giannoli in the book you edited, Alina, in 2018. It was also the right time in Spain, because the first time that a climate law that the idea was floated in Spain was in 2011. So I think the political parties had time to mature and to warm up to having a climate law. And finally, we had this pull factors. We see that there is a convergence of political parties, of the main political parties, in terms of the need to have a law. That's not to say that we don't have climate deniers amongst the political parties. We have a far-right party, Vox, that did not support the law. But the main political parties at the time of adoption and the years prior to that did support having a climate law. And even though they differed in terms of the instruments that should be used, they were all in favor of key elements in order to have a robust law. The civil society did organize around drafting amendments and meeting with different political parties to get a robust law, a law and then a robust law. And finally, citizens in Spain, and again, building on the work that, great work that Alina did, we developed a survey with 1,000 individuals in Spain, a representative sample, quota sampling we used, and citizens in Spain were concerned about climate change. We have very, very small percentage of citizens that are skeptical about climate change. They also recognized that we were not doing enough, and there was a very large support for developing this climate change and energy transition law, and for key elements that made it robust, including the advisory body that we now are going to have and we have to draft.
Thank you, Laura. So this is a very interesting example of the role that citizen support and actually engaging with citizens and political parties can help push for ambitious climate policy even when not everyone is on board to start from. And for our last case, I'd like to go to Colombia. So we are very pleased to have with us Mr. Juan Nicolas Galarza Sanchez, who is a Vice Minister at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. And Mr. Galarza is in charge of actually developing also climate legislation in Colombia, which has established net zero targets, but also your ministry is in charge of coordinating climate action in the country. So I'd like to go back to the discussion about coordination and the institutional background for ensuring that everyone is on board, that it's not just the environmental ministry that's worried about climate change. So could you share your experience in Colombia? How are you going about engaging other ministries? And what is the role of climate law in that, if any?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's really nice to be sharing this experience on a subject that turns out to be incredibly relevant, because as we speak, we are passing this climate action law. So what pertains to the first part of the question, I think a solid advantage that we had starting out for the whole updation process of the NDC was a climate change law that was passed on 2018, and that developed the whole governance structure that allow us to have a more participatory process, something along the lines what Congress member here, Puig, described they're trying to push in Costa Rica. So we created in Dominican Republic, my apologies. And so we created an intersectoral climate change commission, a sort of climate change cabinet. And we asked all sectors to have a comprehensive management plan for climate change. So mine and energy had one, agriculture had one, and we also asked all the states to have that. So we created different layers that allowed us to have a more seamless coordination. And I think something that is really important, and I guess we're all getting there, but for a government that's purely environmental and is not, for instance, like the one of Costa Rica, who covers environmental and energy issues, traditionally, coordination was like a favor that we're doing to the environment, right? But we fortunately have been able to shift to us becoming the umbrella of the entire government, and then everyone realizing that they have their share and that they have to do their fair share in order to be able to do that. So I think that was a significant improvement from the first NDC and the updated NDC. And on top of that then, having that institutional arrangement, this governance structure, we were able to develop a very holistic NDC that made the commitment of reducing Colombia's greenhouse gas emissions by 51%, even though Colombia, as most countries in Latin America, is not a large emitter of greenhouse gases. And we're also giving clear signals in terms of reducing deforestation and achieving carbon neutrality and so on. And then what we wanted to do, and I connect this with the climate law that we are developing now, which is a climate action law. 2018, we had a climate change law that gave governance, and right now we're passing a climate action law to further develop and strengthen the position of the NDC. And that's precisely what we did. So we took our NDC exercise, which was rather robust, and we spent over a year and a half putting it together, again, working with every sector, identifying specific targets for each given sector, asking the private sector to also join with the specific commitments, and asking local governments also to chip in and do their share. And that allows us to now be able to say that out of the 51% of reductions, we have factored clearly with a significant share of funding 75% of the total amount of emissions. So we know that within the framework, the climate change, the UN framework climate change convention, we have our NDC as a legally binding mechanism, but not necessarily the whole structure that is underneath it. So that's precisely what we wanted to do with the climate change, with the climate action law, and that was just including the goals and the mechanisms to achieve the amount of tons when it's related to mitigation, specific actions for adaptation, and so forth. And that's, let's say, the main driver on the law. But we're also taking advantage of this to commit by law to carbon neutrality in 2050, to reinforcing the commitments that we have in terms of zero deforestation, reducing black carbon emissions by 40%, of course, including the 51% of reduction. And this is what we have right now in Congress. We're working also with the private sector, of course. We're really hoping to get a lot of input on that. And as a final thought, we included a chapter to strengthen the carbon markets regulation, let's say, in Colombia. And given the fact that Colombia is covered by, or its territory is covered by 52% of forest, so, or the territory of Colombia is covered by 52% of the forest, then we also saw this as an opportunity to enhance the mechanisms in which Colombia sequesters carbon naturally, and how we can be a provider for a solution not only to Colombia but also to the global crisis that we live.
Thank you so much, and thank you for outlining actually a very key message that what is being negotiated internationally and the pledges which are being made, they only become really strongly legally binding through the national domestic frameworks and laws. And if we look at the data, actually, since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, there have been 323 new laws or amendments to the existing climate laws. But if we dig down a little bit more, very few of those laws contain net zero targets. And it's really encouraging to see so many countries on this panel who actually either have done it already or are on the verge of doing it. So congratulations to you all. And our last speaker, last but not least, Alexander Blagojevic, who is Program Manager for International Development at the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Alexandra's organization really works to bring together parliaments around the world to help enable them to address climate change. So, Alexandra, you just held an International Parliamentary Summit on Sunday here in Glasgow. So what was the outcome of that summit, and what is your organization planning to do to help countries around the world strengthen national institutions, parliaments, and legislative frameworks?
Thank you, Alina. And indeed, for the Inter-Parliamentary Union, creating this bridge between parliamentarians and UNFCCC processes is one of the key objectives of our work on climate change, so that they can come here, they can hear what their ministers have pledged, and they can understand the whole process. We did indeed have a pre-COP parliamentary meeting in Rome in cooperation with the Italian Parliament, and last Sunday here in Glasgow in cooperation with the UK Parliament. And one of the key things that was really emphasized in this meeting in Glasgow was the need for parliamentarians to stop, sit and waiting and take action across their functions, legislative, budgetary, and oversight. A particular emphasis was actually put on their representative function because it was felt that there was a paradox where you have people who are increasingly concerned with climate change and affected by climate change, and yet those concerns do not necessarily reflect in pledges, in commitments, in strategies, in policies, and that parliamentarians as elected representatives of the people should create that bridge between people's expectations and what actually the government and the parliament should be doing. So for us in the IPU, we also see it as a political incentive for parliamentarians to engage back home and engage through their citizens, including with the young voters who are really the ones championing these issues in many countries. So what does it mean for the IPU? For us, we are about to adopt a new IPU strategy for the next 5 years, and it was a result of a broad consultation with our member parliaments, and climate change for the first time is at the same level as more traditional IPU themes like democracy, gender equality, and politics. So for us, this is a big task ahead, and from what we see in this conference as well, the emphasis is going to be in particular on translation of NDCs and pledges into legislation and action, and in addition also citizen engagement.
Thank you, Alexandra. So I think we started today with the message that in order to translate pledges into action, we need strong institutions at the national level, and we need strong legal and policy frameworks which make those commitments legally binding. We then talk about the key features that institutions can take, and we emphasize that there is no one-size-fits-all. And I think the discussion today shows the richness and the diversity of approaches, and also the different roles of different types of stakeholders, parliaments, governments, coordinating bodies, independent providers of analysis that could also serve as a watchdog for progress. So I think we've got really interesting set of examples, and we have a few minutes to take a couple of questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please kindly walk to one of the microphones, introduce yourself, and if you could take off your mask while you are at the microphone, that would help everyone to hear you. Would anyone like to ask a question? Okay. The lady at the back, yes, please. And please, you could, yeah, please go ahead to the microphone.
Natalie Bennett, Green Party member of the House of Lords. And my question is specifically to Mike, but also to others. My critical assessment of the UK Committee on Climate Change is, as you said, targets are set by the science. And if you look at the carbon brief assessment of the UK, we are on track for net zero 2050, whatever you think of the net. But when you look at the actual plans, which as you say are adapted for what's seen as political reality, carbon brief says we're nowhere on track for actually delivering. So I guess it's a question specifically to Mike, but to anyone really, how do you actually, I think the great government's gap is lots of governments are setting targets, but how do you really see that you have policies that will actually deliver those targets? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take one more question, and then please.
Simon Dörr from German radio station. I would like to know, addressing Mrs. Lazaro, what do you say to countries like Germany, since Germany is one of the biggest emitters, now starting off in a new legislation period, with a historical chance to do things like you did in Spain? What do you say to a country like Germany?
Thank you. Mike, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's such a crucial question, and I think actually it gets to the real value of having an independent advisor, actually. The analysis you're talking about was based on the work from our committee, which said, we've set these targets, but we haven't yet set the plans in place to meet them. And I think we haven't talked a lot, actually, about the watchdog role that the independent advisor can play. And that is a bit, I think, has to be independent. You know, you can't be marking your own homework as a government. I think you have to have an outside body that is saying, well, are you doing what you said you will do? And as you said, in the UK, we're not at that point yet. I think the really valuable thing actually we have in the UK Climate Act is we have a regular cycle of that. So every year we provide that report, and we provide it to Parliament, for Parliament to then scrutinise and push the government to bring in more policy. The government then has an opportunity to move their policy on further. And I'm pleased that we have seen some of that, not all of it, but some of it since we gave our last assessment. And so this, in a sense, is kind of what you will always see, I think, that you set a tough target, you then develop policy to deliver some of it, you probably haven't done all of it, and then you have an independent advisor to hold your feet to the fire, to push you on and to get you onto the next stage, to identify the next bits that need to do to land a new plan on your desk for how to make up the gap. And then you incrementally get to, hopefully, where you need to be. So I think you're right, the UK doesn't yet have all the plans that we need and all the policies we need to deliver the targets, but we can still get there. There is still time to put those in. And having the CCC there, I think, saying, this is what's good, this is what needs work, and here are the things that you can do to align it. I think that process is a very useful one for this question of translating pledges to action. But the work is certainly not done.
Mike is being quite modest, so I take liberty to add as well. Actually, at the Grantham Research Institute, we've done a study on how the information produced by the Climate Change Committee has been used in the 10 years of parliamentary debates in the UK. And one interesting conclusion which really surprised us was that the information produced by the committee was not only used in the hearings on climate change, but actually penetrated debates on energy policy, on energy bill, on infrastructure bill. 60% of all of the debates on energy in Parliament use information produced by Climate Change Committee. So in addition to this watchdog function, they also help in the UK really mainstream climate concerns into other policy areas. And I think that's a very important function which sometimes the government needs help with. So thanks for that. Anyone else wanted to comment on this question? If not, Laura, you have the floor on Germany.
Thank you. Well, I'm not an expert in Germany, but I think it's fair to recognize historical leadership by Germany in pushing the agenda in Europe. I think that would probably be my first point. I think it's also important to acknowledge that due to the latest ruling, Germany is set to increase its greenhouse gas reduction actions. Perhaps one of the experiences that could be of use to perhaps exchange on is the Just Transition strategy. Spain has quite a broad framework, the energy and climate framework that includes not only the climate change and energy transition law, but also it includes a just transition strategy. Obviously, the size of our coal mining regions and the people employed in coal mining in Spain is nowhere near that of Germany. So we know for a fact that you have a much bigger problem and a much bigger issue. And Spain has set up an interesting institution. So it's got the Just Transition Institute, and modelled on the French experience, we also have set up just transition agreements, so similar to the just transition contracts in France. So that is something that at an international level, adaptation and just transition are the issues that I think could probably help in bilateral exchanges.
Thank you, Laura. I think we have 1 minute, so we could try to squeeze a real quick question. If anyone has any, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hill-Smith from Clyde & Co in Legal. International. My question follows on from Mike, what you were saying about the watchdog role of the CCC and the role you have in holding government's feet to the fire. And then I was just wondering what your perspective is, and I guess this opens it up to the floor. As an advisory institution, what do you envisage being the best teeth to force implementation? And I guess a follow-on question from that is, what do you think is the role of climate litigation as a means of enforcement and really holding their feet to the fire? Thank you.
Well, we have just half a minute. Let's try.
In a modern democracy like the UK's, there is only really one lever, which is the court of public opinion, fundamentally. That's the thing that an elected government will care about. And so I think the role of the independent watchdog, I think, is just to make everything as transparent and as clear as possible, so that if a government says they're going to do something, you know if they have done it or not after the fact. So I think that is the most powerful thing. Litigation absolutely can be a part of that. But fundamentally, a government will do only what it feels it wants to do. And so making sure that the public are pushing them to do what they ought to do is the thing. And so a transparent framework that encourages that is vital in my view.
Great. Well, with this, thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you to online audience and in-person audience, and feel free to continue discussions with the speakers after that event. Have a good evening.